these are a couple of tweets from legendary heavyweight champion George Foreman regarding Anthony Joshua and the current crop of heavyweights. He says here, Anthony Joshua is a special talent. Fighters like him are far and few between. Seem like they don't come in bunches. One every 25 to 30 years. Only time beats them. Somebody here asks him, do you think you could beat Anthony Joshua in your prime? And someone else asks, in your prime, who beats you? This person says, for me, none of today's heavyweight crop would beat you apart from Fury, but I would still put my money on you catching him. Your era was full of top men. George Foreman responds by saying, I like the heavyweights of today. They are good enough to have beaten me back in the day. Made for good matches, though. Now, for those of you who are not that familiar with George Foreman, maybe some of you guys who are younger or newer boxing fans, you may not realize that George Foreman has been saying stuff like this for decades. When Larry Holmes was heavyweight champion, remember this was a guy who George Foreman never fought, and there was a rivalry between George Foreman and Larry Holmes. George Foreman was one of the people saying that Larry Holmes might actually be better than Muhammad Ali. When Lennox Lewis came along, and remember at the time, Lennox Lewis was getting absolutely shredded by the American press. For most of his career, the American press gave Lennox Lewis virtually no credit at all. They trashed him all the time, whilst bigging up the American heavyweights, of course. But George Foreman was one of the few people in the United States for a long time in Lennox Lewis's career. Pretty much the entirety of Lewis's career, George Foreman was singing his praises. He was saying Lennox Lewis is a special talent. He's an all-time great heavyweight. At one point, George Foreman went as far as saying Lennox Lewis is the greatest heavyweight of all time. Yeah, George Foreman said this. So he has a long history of bigging up contemporary talent and asserting his opinion that contemporary talent is just as good as the talent back in the 70s when he was fighting, if not better. He's got a long history of doing this, so it doesn't at all surprise me that he's saying that Anthony Joshua is special and fighters like him only come around once every 25 to 30 years and only time beats them. And it doesn't at all surprise me to see him saying this, that the heavyweights today could have beaten him back in the days. That's how George Foreman is. He's not one of these old timers who begrudges the new generation. He's not one of these old timers who puts on rose tinted glasses and looks back at the old days and says, oh God, it was so much better back then. Of course, there are some things better back in the old days. There are some fighters from the old days who could have beaten some fighters today. But when you're talking about the heavyweight division especially, the size of these athletes now, it starts to get a little improbable matching an Anthony Joshua against a Rocky Marciano and expecting a competitive fight. It starts to get a bit improbable matching a Tyson Fury against a Jack Dempsey, and expecting a competitive fight. And I'm sure some historians are going to say Jack Dempsey knocked out Jess Willard and he was nearly as big as Tyson Fury. That's true. But back in the days, they had people like Primo Carnera, Abe Simon, Jess Willard. These were very big heavyweights, but they were very, very slow, uncoordinated, clunky. They weren't athletic the way that today's heavyweights are athletic. They weren't big men who could move like today's big men. They were slow, robotic, and stiff. And I know people are going to say AJ is slow, robotic, and stiff. Trust me, he is fluid, fast, and nimble compared to somebody like a Jess Willard or an Abe Simon or a Primo Carnera. Trust me. So the big heavyweights back then were just nowhere near as good as the big heavyweights today. And it reaches a point where human beings keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you get to a point where some of the great heavyweights of the past, as skilled as they were, in many instances more skilled than heavyweights today, they just weren't big enough to compete or beat a lot of the heavyweights today. Now, some of the smaller heavyweights would have still done well. I think that Mike Tyson could still have done well in the heavyweight division today, even though he was only 5'10", 215 to 220 in his prime. I think against the right fighters, he still could have done very well. In fact, I think he would have given all of the heavyweights today problems, maybe even beaten most of them. I don't want to say all of them. Maybe most of them in his prime. Because he was a tremendous athlete, Mike Tyson. Fast, explosive. But even with him, there's a limit in terms of, the size of opponent that he would be able to beat. Because Mike Tyson fought some tall guys. He fought Carter Truth Williams, who was like 6'4", 6'5", Bone Crusher Smith around 6'4", Tony Tucker, Tyrell Biggs around 6'5", 6'6". These were tall guys, Jose Rabota, but most of them weren't heavy. Like, for example, Tony Tucker at 6'5", he only weighed about, 219, 220, something like that. So kind of a Wilder type physique without Wilder's power. The same for Carter Truth Williams. 6'4", 6'5", but he only weighed about 220. And certainly didn't have anything like Deontay Wilder punching power. So from a strength point of view, Mike Tyson was still strong compared to those guys because he weighed the same even though he was 8 inches shorter. But with today's heavyweights, the likes of AJ, Fury, I mean, these guys are enormous. So from a strength point of view, and even just the punch trajectory, Tyson Fury's 6'9". Mike Tyson's never fought nobody 6'9". His punching power is definitely going to suffer when he's got a guy 6'9" and he's only 5'10", short little arms, 71-inch reach. He's having to reach up that high against a 6'9" opponent. That's very tough. And you're going to lose power having to, punch upwards those extra inches. So, yeah, there has to reach a point where even a extremely talented small heavyweight like Tyson would just find it too much against a 21st century heavyweight. Joe Frazier today would really be a cruiserweight. In his prime, Joe Frazier was under 210 pounds. Most of the cruiserweights today weigh around 210 when they get in the ring. The cruiserweight limit is 200 pounds, of course, or just over whatever it is, but when they get in the ring, they're like 210. So Frazier was really a cruiserweight by today's standards. Muhammad Ali, even him very early on in his career, would have been a cruiserweight. Later on in his career, yeah, he would have been a small heavyweight by today's standards. On and on it goes. But the point I'm making is, as good as the heavyweights were back in the days, human beings keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the big athletes continue to get more and more coordinated, more and more athletic. Do you understand what I'm saying? George Foreman obviously realizes this. I think even Nigel Benn has spoken about this before. They realize this. But as I've said in another video recently, we haven't yet seen a new Mike Tyson emerge. Imagine someone with a similar kind of talent level to Mike Tyson, but who was 6'2" rather than 5'10". We haven't seen anything like that emerge yet because American boxing has been on a decline for the past 15 years or so. And American athletes have been going into other sports rather than boxing. We need to address that problem, and we need to get those American athletes going back into boxing, and then we will see another Tyson-type talent, or a Joe Frazier, or a Roy Jones, or even a George Foreman. So I commend George Foreman for being as gracious and humble as he is, bigging up the contemporary talent, not being a bitter old man who just trashes everybody around today. Yeah, I commend him. And as far as his perception of Anthony Joshua, he thinks he's very special. That remains to be seen. George Foreman may be an oracle, I don't know, but I'm not going to jump out there and say Anthony Joshua is as special as George Foreman is saying he is. That's George Foreman's opinion. Of course, he's entitled to it. I'm not going to co-sign that right now. I want to see Anthony Joshua against Wilder and Fury before I start making that kind of judgment. And as far as the heavyweights today being good enough to beat a Prime Foreman was a small heavyweight by today's standards. It's another thing a lot of people don't realize. Prime Foreman weighed between maybe 217, 218, and about 225. When he fought Ali, I think he was about 218, 219. When he fought Ali, somewhere around there. I think when he fought Ron Lyle, he was like 225. I'm getting these weights off the top of my head here, people. I could be off a little bit. But Foreman wasn't big. He was 6'3.5". He was a natural heavyweight. Don't get it twisted. You know, when he was coming in weighing, let's say 220, that's a natural 220. That's not him pumped up full of weights and all kind of supplements. No, that's natural. That's just eating whatever a Texas boy back in the 1960s and 70s would eat and hitting the bag and running and doing push-ups. So he was a natural guy at that weight, and he was solid. You know, I don't want to say he was the most ripped heavyweight you've ever seen, but he certainly wasn't fat. He was athletic at 220. But he wasn't big by today's standards at all. He was actually very slow as well, despite the fact he was a relatively small heavyweight by today's standards. He was slow. He was easy to hit. He could be hurt. I mean, Muhammad Ali stopped him, although it was more fatigue than being concussed. But he was down against Ron Lyle. I mean, are we to believe that none of the heavyweights today can hit as hard as Ron Lyle? I'm telling you they can. So, yeah, I'm glad that Foreman, someone from that era, doesn't have rose-tinted glasses on. I'm not saying that George Foreman couldn't have done well in today's era. I mean, he was not so short to make it impossible for him in today's era because, you know, 6'3.5", 6'4", it's there or thereabouts in today's era. It's still okay-ish, yeah, in terms of the height. But I'm also realistic enough to realize that there are probably heavyweights around today that could have beat him. I mean, Jimmy Young beat him. Jimmy Young, a cruiserweight. In today's world, he's a cruiserweight. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.